and then we will be at your... So.
Magic.
Magic, yeah.
Good. I was getting perplexed. I'm rather glad to see that the students who are sitting at the back have gone, because my problem is to cover enough material, and I think I would have had to have spent more time on the basic material in our spirit level book, showing that more unequal societies suffer from more of a wide range of social problems. What I really want to do is get on to talking about why those relationships exist, why more unequal societies do worse, what our sensitivity is to greater inequality, and what we do about it, which is, in a way, the most important question. So I'm going to run through slides which are the basic material of our book, but I'm going to do it so quickly that it'll be difficult for you if you don't already know them. I like to start off with this one, showing how miserable we all are, because one of the things about, if we're going to move towards sustainability, most people see it as involving a sacrifice of the real quality of life, and our real quality of life isn't as good as it could be. Everyone in that picture looks miserable and depressed. These are young people in the prime of life going to work in London on in the morning. And yet, you know the data probably that in many countries depression and mental illness have been rising. Our Office of National Statistics survey very recently showed that about 20% of the population suffer from depression and anxiety problems at any point of time. The huge range of social problems. The social problems that get worse with inequality are all the problems that are more common at the bottom of the social ladder. So although there's ill health and violence and so on at the top of the social ladder, they're all more common at the bottom. And you may think that it's fairly obvious that those kinds of problems get worse with bigger income differences between rich and poor. The surprising thing is that they get worse not just amongst the poor, but it changes the whole social fabric of a society, makes us all more worried about status and social position, and these problems get worse amongst the large majority of the population. I need to start off with this graph that is a very long way from inequality, because it shows that absolute standards of living are no longer what matters in the rich developed world. In most European countries. You've got life expectancy against national income per person, rapid rises in the early stages of economic development, and then levelling out. And I'm going to talk about the rich developed societies there, where there's no relationship between GNP and life expectancy. And indeed, it's not just on that cross-sectional basis there's no relationship, but if you look at changes over periods of 10, 20, even 40 years, looking at rising levels of income in our societies and changes in health, there's no relation, or very little relation. And this isn't some marginal sort of economic view of a few marginal economists. Angus Deaton was president of the American Economic Association, and he's saying this. And if you know a book by Charles Kenny, I think, called Getting Better, he shows that that is true of all sorts of other measures of the real quality of our lives. They are no longer related to economic growth. And of course, if we replace what I had before here was national income per head, if we put instead CO2 emissions per head, it's a very similar graph. And what you see is there are countries producing much more carbon into the atmosphere and getting very little for it. We start achieving high levels of life expectancy at much lower levels of CO2 emissions. And so, in the rich developed societies, we've really got to the end of the main benefits of economic growth. It is what's transformed the quality of our lives, but it's largely done its work. And it's crucial to be aware of that as we have to think more about sustainability. So, these are the countries I'm going to talk about, the ones that were up there on that first graph. Just to emphasize, those countries, Norway, USA, twice as rich as Israel, Greece, Portugal, no effect on life expectancy and no effect on all sorts of other measures of well-being. But within our societies there are these extraordinary social gradients. This one is life expectancy again, but if I showed violence or children's well-being or anything else, huge gradients within our societies. So income, or something like it, is very important within our societies, but doesn't matter apparently at all between our societies. That's a paradox, and the explanation is very simple. Within our societies, we're looking at the effects of relative income, or social position, where you are in relation to other people, the social ranking system. And, of course, as soon as you start to think about that and recognize that it's not your absolute standards of living that are affecting you now, things like damp housing matter, and cold and so on, but much more important is where your income puts you in relation to other people, the social consequences of that, the psychosocial effects of that. So what happens if we make those differences between us bigger or smaller? And as you know, that's what I'm going to talk about, and the data we use to answer that question is the scale of income differences between rich and poor in each country, the gap between the top and bottom 20% of the population. But the important point to realize is simply that the gap amongst these more equal countries, the Scandinavian countries and Japan, is half the size of the gap in some of the other rich developed countries. They're all rich developed market democracies, but very important differences in the degree of inequality within them. And you've seen, I'm sure, that if you put together all these kinds of problems that you can download from the web, data for each country, so homicide rates in each country, or how much people trust each other, or measures of mental illness, you get these extraordinary gradients showing those more unequal countries, USA, Portugal, USA, doing worse on all those kind of things, and the Scandinavian countries and Japan doing better, in really extraordinary relationships. And as I said, not related to GNP per capita. Here's the same figures for each country on that axis. GNP per capita, no relationship. And the same for child well-being measures. This is 39 components of the UNICEF index of child well-being in rich countries, and the more unequal countries doing less well in terms of child well-being. Really crucially important. We do worry about children's welfare in our societies and what's going on. We talk a lot about child poverty. It's children's relative poverty, where they are in relation to the rest of us, that matters, and how unequal the societies they're growing up in, because that affects the social environment they're growing up in. But just to the last time I make this point, that same index of child well-being unrelated to national income per person. Now, of course, we're hooked on growth because it reduces unemployment and raises profits and so on, but we must find other ways of dealing with that problem. The New Economics Foundation in London, one of the solutions would be to reduce the working week. But there are all sorts of ways we can tackle that. And I emphasized earlier on that measures of well-being are not related to national income per person, because it means if we have to reduce carbon emissions as dramatically as we do have to reduce them, it means that we don't have to sacrifice the real quality of our lives. In fact, there are ways in which we can move towards sustainability while dramatically increasing the real quality of our lives. The societies we live in, dominated by consumerism, in the way we all try and show our sort of worth to each other through consumption, the kind of goods and clothes and so on that we have, that's an incredibly alienated form of social expression. And increasingly it comes out of a lack of real social contact, which could provide the social fulfillment that is so fundamental to human beings. Okay, I'm going to run very quickly. This is a measure of trust. People trust each other less in more unequal societies. The same picture from the United States. People trust each other less in more unequal American states. We've done all this analysis on American states as well as internationally, just to check that the picture is reliable. Mental illness, much higher levels of mental illness in more unequal countries. There are threefold differences in the proportion of the population with mental illnesses in different countries, related so strongly to inequality. It goes from about 8% of the population with any mental illness in the year preceding the survey up to about 3 times that level. I used to work in health promotion in Bristol in the southwest of England. We tried to evaluate our work. We would have been delighted if we could have made a 10% reduction in a problem. This is a 300% difference. Infant mortality rates, that's a sort of twofold difference. Levels of violence measured by homicide. These red dots are American states and Canadian provinces, but look at the scale of differences. It's about 15 homicides per million there, 150 there. This is a very well-established relationship. Lots of academic papers looking at it in different contexts. Violence is more common in more unequal societies. Not only do we trust each other less, but we get angry with each other more often. Imprisonment, 10 times the proportion of the population locked up in more unequal societies. This is log scale, so it goes from about 40 to 400 people in prison per 100,000 population. Very expensive, as well as very nasty. And that's mainly due to more punitive sentencing in more unequal societies. Some of it is more crime, but most of it is harsher sentencing. Teenage birth rates, again, there's about a 10-fold difference. This is births per 1,000 women in their teens, going from about 5 to, 6 times that height in the UK. We lead Europe, but 10-fold differences if you look at the USA up there. So quite different problems, all with the same tendency to be worse in more unequal societies. The USA, this is social mobility. Americans like to think they have the highest social mobility, but in fact they have the lowest. And the only joke I have was actually my co-author Kate's, and she likes to say if the Americans want to live the American dream, they should go to Denmark. But basically the measure of social mobility comes from the big cohort studies in each country where kids are followed up from birth to later life, and they're asking, is there a close relationship between father's income and son's income? I would say it's not mothers and daughters because women's activity rates have changed so much, but they're asking, do rich fathers have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons? And the answer is that father's income matters much more in more unequal societies. But you see, a country like the USA, it has amongst the lowest social mobility. in the rich world. It has the highest obesity rates, the highest levels of violence, amongst the lowest levels of life expectancy, highest prison populations, and Britain, as the next most unequal society, pretty well, does amongst the worst in Europe in most of those things. And then another group of countries, the Scandinavian ones, that do well on all those things. So these different problems move together. And that means that to explain that phenomenon, you can't explain it in terms of something that might affect violence or might affect health. You've got to think of a very deep-seated social explanation that can drive quite different outcomes. Nobody has yet suggested a better explanation than these relationships with inequality. We've looked. I'm not going to show you any more of those because I do want to spend time on the what's going on behind these relationships. You probably don't want statistics, but you can look at inequality measures from different sources in different contexts. You can look at it over time. This is changes in health following a rise in inequality. The effects on health seem to start to come through after about 3 years after the change in inequality, and go on coming through up to about 12 years later. I don't know why that's disappeared. I can paint my own picture there. Inequality, and this is what it would have shown you, is the results of a meta-analysis of multi-level models, many of them following people through over time. It's a paper from the British Medical Journal looking at how health is affected by inequality, containing data for 60 million people, individual data for 60 million people, in that it's a meta-analysis. Our data is extraordinarily simple because we are trying to get a picture across in a form that people can understand it. And some of our critics don't realize there is much more sophisticated analysis elsewhere in the journals. Right. This is not just about taxes and benefits. It's also about the inequality of earnings before taxes and benefits. Sorry, I'm going to... No, I'll have to... why income differences have widened so dramatically is largely because the rich have run away from the rest of us. And in some countries, budgets have gone on doing a little bit of redistribution, but not enough to offset the rise in differences in pre-tax earnings. So we must think about tackling this both through redistribution and through reducing the income differences before tax. It's perhaps a bit out of place. I was emphasizing the scale of the differences between the performance of more and less equal countries, sometimes tenfold differences, or in case of mental illness or teenage births, 2- or 3-fold differences, because those differences are too large to be driven just by the poor. To explain the differences in life expectancy between Japan and USA, average life expectancy, if those were due to differences in life expectancy amongst the bottom 10%, the poor in Japan would have to be living 45 years longer than the poor in the USA. That's not the explanation. The effects of inequality go all the way across society. This is old data looking at infant mortality classified by father's occupational class in Sweden, the blue bars, and England and Wales, in the more unequal society, the orangey red bars. The differences are biggest at the bottom of society. The differences between Britain Sweden the biggest at the bottom of society, but even at the top of society, Sweden was doing better. And we've now seen a lot of papers. I mean, there are about 5 mentioned in our book, but I should think there must be 10 I know of now, which show the effect of inequality seems to have that pattern. It has its biggest effect at the bottom of society, but even most of the way up to the top, people do better if they live in a more equal society. What that means is if you, with your given level of education, your position in the occupational hierarchy, your income levels, if you lived in a more equal society, you may live a little bit longer. You'd be less likely to become a victim of violence. Your children might do a bit better in terms of these international maths and literacy scores. They'd be less likely to get involved in drugs or to become teenage parents. In that sense, we all do better in a more equal society. Okay, now I've got through the sort of basic picture. I want to get on to, in a way, what's really important. You know, all these really important changes, people behaving differently in more and less equal societies, mean that inequality is doing something to us. And because most of our outcomes are behavioral, I think it means it's doing something psychosocial. And what I think is going on, and these are 2 pictures of social class hierarchy. This is an opposite kind of picture. This is the classification that our Office of National Statistics now uses, 8 categories of people by occupation. I think we're talking about the social class gradients that we all know of and recognize in just about all these outcomes. But whether it's a question of whether our societies are a very steep social pyramid like that, or a much shallower social pyramid like that. And I think that the bigger material differences emphasize and make more powerful all the ways in which social class and social status imprint themselves on us throughout life. Some of those we understand very well, and others we don't. But, you know, whether it's effects of social class on or social status on kids' educational performance, or on their likelihood of becoming teenage parents, or stress responses affecting health, all those kinds of things are made more powerful. It's also a matter of whether we feel valued or devalued. We found in the FTSE, the Financial Times share index of the biggest 100 companies in the UK, the average difference in pay between the chief executive and the lowest paid full-time worker is 300 to 1. And there's no more powerful way of telling a whole swathe of the population that they're almost worthless than to pay them 1/3 of 1% of what the chief executive gets. And of course, you know, I emphasize that we're looking at psychosocial pathways. This isn't an effect of air pollution or damp housing. It's more about feelings of superiority and inferiority, driving consumerism. It has important environmental effects because inequality drives consumerism, intensifies consumerism, I should say. It also leads to greater, what I call social evaluation anxieties, more worries about how we're seen and judged. If some people are so important and other people are considered almost worthless, we all become more neurotic about how we're seen and judged. And for some people, that's a real anxiety. And so, you know, you withdraw from social life, or you have to have drinks before you go to a party or whatever. I want to say something, though, about the very fundamentals of this. And it was Hobbes, the political philosopher in the 17th century, who talked about the competition, the potential for competition of each against all. You know, because members of the same species have the same needs, we eat the same foodstuffs, we need the same shelter, we compete for sexual partners, there is always, in almost any species, enormous potential for conflict between members of that species. And even in our garden, I notice that the birds fight other members of their species on the bird table much more often. But what Hobbes missed, I think, was that we also have the opposite potential. We have the potential to be the greatest source of assistance and help and cooperation and love and learning. Other people can be your worst rivals or your best sources of support and assistance. And we have become very sensitive. Because the quality of social relations is so important, we've become very sensitive to that, to social hierarchy and to friendship. But you see, it's about how you deal with material life. Do we fight each other for everything, or is the sharing and reciprocity? These two things, social status and friendship, come up in the social epidemiology. Friendship is one of the most powerful protectors of health. Whether or not you have friends turns out to be marginally more important than whether you smoke to survival over a follow-up period. That comes out of a meta-analysis of 150 studies of friendship and health. And social status, particularly low social status or bigger inequalities, damaging to health. They are the opposites, because social status is about dominance hierarchies, pecking orders. It's a form of social relation. But friendship is the opposite of that. It's about reciprocity, social obligations, sharing, mutuality. The gift is the symbol of friendship because it is the concrete expression that you and I are not going to fight over access to whatever it is. I give you this, and your sense of obligation, of indebtedness, that some psychologists say is a human universal, so you reciprocate the gift. Some psychologists say is a basic social compact. As Marshall Salin says, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. So it's our tuning to how we deal with material life. Am I in a world where I must fight for what I can get? Where we're all rivals? Or am I in a world where I depend on cooperation and reciprocity? You know, are we in the same boat together or not? And that is the powerful signal given by the extent of inequality. It's interesting, this word companion. If you think what it means, where it comes from, con and pan, it's the people with whom you share bread. And that's, of course, why we still eat together. It's important not to fight over access to basic necessities. So eating together, and of course the religious symbolism in terms of the communion and so on. So what I've been showing you in terms of inequality, the effects of inequality on social relations, the quality of social life, comes from a very deep-seated and evolved psychological sensitivity, because these things have always been crucial to human well-being and survival. Can I have another few minutes, okay? Yeah. In the epidemiology, the social epidemiology, the research that's gone on around the world into trying to understand why there are these huge social class differences in health in different societies. Anything from 5 to 12-year differences in life expectancy between people living in richer and poorer areas. Enormous human rights abuse. But what has happened in the epidemiology over the last 20 years is we've become aware of how important psychosocial factors are. Working through the biology of chronic stress affecting immune system, cardiovascular system, all sorts of, there are all sorts of powerful physiological effects. But the main groups of psychosocial risk factor are things to do with low social status, social exclusion, or whether or not you have friends, the quality of social life, which, as I say, good friendship networks are highly protective, and stress in early life, both prenatally, maternal stress in pregnancy affecting fetal development, and also the early childhood sensitivity to what goes on in the family and the quality of nurturing, if you like. But all those things are telling us about the same underlying source of chronic stress. It's to do with how we negotiate social relationships. That in more unequal, the insecurities of low social status are rather like the insecurities that you may have from a difficult early childhood. Feeling you're not valued, insecurities, anxieties, things like that. And social connections, friendship is important because it makes you feel better about yourself. The people who value you, you get positive feedback. And so, in a sense, this is about that issue of whether we're valued or devalued. And of course, the scale of inequality, the social hierarchy in society has such powerful effects on that and makes us all more worried about it. There are nice studies that show what really pushes up our levels of stress hormones are, this is experimental evidence from over 200 studies, this is a meta-analysis, the kind of experimental tasks that they get people to do, the ones that really push up your levels of stress hormones are tasks that include what they call social evaluative threats to self-esteem or social status, in which others can judge you negatively. You know, your feelings if people don't sit next to you, feel excluded and so on, that you're unattractive, you're boring, you're socially gauche, whereas friendship has the opposite effect. Those sensitivities are a very powerful part of this. And as I said, in more unequal societies, people are more worried about how they're seen and judged. You know, because you're living in a world where some people are so important and others are so unimportant. And actually one of the responses to this is you talk yourself up. You start saying you're really good at things. I don't know if you know the joke that about 90% of the population thinking they're better drivers than average. In this study, they got people to rate themselves not on their driving, asking them whether their driving was better than the average in their country, but on a lot of other criteria. So, are you cleverer than other people in your society? Are you more generous? You know, they went through a lot of different characteristics. And they find in more unequal societies, there's inequality along the bottom here, in the more unequal societies, more people think they're better than average. You talk yourself up. In a more unequal society where you're judged more, one of the responses is to become narcissistic, to go in for this sort of self-enhancement, self-aggrandizement. You can no longer afford to be modest about your abilities and achievements. You have to start saying how good you are at everything. Narcissism, closely related to that self-enhancement, rises with inequality. Okay, so what's been happening? I said earlier that our society's income differences have been widening because the top have run away from the rest of us. You see, in the 1970s and around 1980, CEOs of big companies were getting 20 or 30 times as much as the most junior workers. And then around 1990, that took off. And so now they're getting hundreds of times as much. That's the damage we've got to reverse. And if you look at what's been happening to inequality over the whole of the 20th century, these high inequalities up until about 1930, and then they come tumbling down and bottom out in the 1970s and then rise from about 1980 onwards. A very general pattern. Most countries don't show this tendency to remain more egalitarian. That is very closely related to the waxing and waning of the strength of the labour movement. And if you look at strength of unions, this is a paper that looks at 16 OECD countries over quite a long period. So they take multiple observations of the strength of union membership in different societies and levels of inequality. It's an astonishingly close relationship. I don't think that's just what trade unions do for their members. I think it's a reflection of the whole strength of the countervailing voice provided by the labour movement in social democratic parties, in trade unions, in other forms. But you see, if we're going to really, and if you like, fear of the labour movement, fear of communism, if you like, fear of socialism was good for capitalism. And as it disappeared, we're getting back to the levels of inequality we saw in the 1920s. Just a quick point about how this... we mustn't have a sort of single-issue politics. I suppose I'm a fine person to say that, having worked on inequality exclusively. But I think that our future depends on portraying a picture of the kind of society we need to move towards. And it not only needs to be a more equal one, it needs to be a sustainable one. And of course there are things that, ways in which those two things to come together. Not only does greater inequality intensify consumerism, which is the greatest threat to sustainability, but it also means people work longer hours, they save less of their income, they get into debt more. So we've got to become more equal societies if we're going to reach sustainability. I'm involved in an attempt to produce what they call a new development paradigm. This is a working group which the United Nations asked Bhutan, with its gross national happiness, to set up. And they are trying to, in a way, paint a picture of the future we should be moving towards, and how we get there in terms of greater equality, sustainability, the need for more forms of economic democracy, cooperatives, employee ownership, mutuals, things like that, which not only have smaller income differences within them, but also have many other benefits in terms of quality of social relations and environmental responsibility. A website there, if people are interested in that. We're trying to put together a wider alliance around the world from groups interested in these issues. I hope eventually as a pressure group. I'll skip that. I was going to show you a trailer of a film, but I can't do that and I haven't got time for it. But a film that we hope will be the equivalent of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, but the equivalent for greater equality, is being made by a very good production company. It's being funded substantially by crowdfunding. So if people can help by donating to that, the web address for funding is thespiritleveldocumentary.com. It's intended as a campaigning film. with international content. So thank you very much. I must stop there. I've had more than my time.